Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. The stories I'm going to tell you about are here to entertain you, satisfy your curiosity, and lull you to sleep. But you will be able to return later if you wish. Tonight we are going to delve into some of the many historical mysteries that surround the rich history of New York City. A note to some of our Spotify listeners first. If the quality of the audio seems distorted for you, it may be due to a Spotify setting called audio normalization that is enabled. You can disable it under the settings within the app, found by clicking on your profile picture. This has eliminated the distortion for most of you. If this doesn't work, you can try different audio or video quality settings or switching to audio only. Rest assured that we haven't changed our recordings. Also, I would like to take a few seconds of your time to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project, get more of it, and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to contribute directly to our work financially. Our least expensive tier is $3.50 per month, but it doesn't mean you will get less. We let people contribute what they wish to or can, and everyone gets everything that is on our page. Because the world is a better place when the sun shines for everyone. You will gain access to several exclusive episodes. This month we began a series on famous queens. Also, all our episodes can be downloaded for offline listening with and without background sounds. And our patrons have early access to our stories as well. We have added links to Patreon, as well as links to different streaming options, which may be better suited for you. But before we begin, if you wish to, you may close your eyes and allow yourself to forget about any worries as we embark on this adventure together. Now assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath. And when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now, let's jump right in and start with the earliest example we'll explore tonight. Do you know that maybe a buried pirate treasure is waiting to be discovered somewhere near Manhattan or on Long Island? The treasure of Captain William Kidd, a privateer turned pirate who was active in New York City during the late 17th century. At least, this is what legends say. And as often, legends are rooted in history. So for our first story of the night, let's find out what this lost treasure story is about. As you know, New York City started as a Dutch settlement on the island of Manhattan, at the southern tip of the island. A trading post called New Amsterdam, which stayed in Dutch hands for 40 years, from 1624 to 1664, before it was transferred to England as part of the peace treaty after the Second Anglo-Dutch War. New Amsterdam had grown to have around 1,500 to 2,000 inhabitants, so it was more a town, a big village, rather than a city at this point. But compared with other European settlements in North America, around 1660, it was still significant. For comparison, the largest city in North America at the time, by far, was Mexico City, which had 70,000 to 100,000 people. Technically, it had been founded by the Spanish after their conquest of the Aztecs 140 years earlier, but founded on the site of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, which was even bigger than that, with more than 100,000 people. So it cannot really be counted as a European new settlement. So, of the colonies founded in North America by Europeans on sites that were not urbanized before, the largest by 1660 was Jamestown in Virginia, an English colony with 4,000 to 5,000 people, and an economy based on tobacco, which was booming at the time. After that, the largest settlements were St. Augustine in Florida, Santa Fe in New Mexico, both Spanish colonies, and New Amsterdam, the three with around 1,500 people. So despite its small size, New Amsterdam was still respectable relative to others. It had a good strategic location too, and it made it an attractive gain for the English. When the colony changed hands and became known as New York, which was officially done in 1667 after 3 years of occupation, its population remained very diverse. There were Dutch settlers who stayed and became some of the oldest families of New York. There were English settlers too, in growing numbers, and a few more Europeans from various countries, and Africans both free and enslaved. It was not spectacular at first, but this trading post took off, and 30 years later, by the 1690s, at the time when our story is going to take place, it had turned into a colonial port with 4,000 to 5,000 people. It served as a hub for trade in furs, timber, and agricultural goods, and between its port and the larger population, it began to occupy the rest of Manhattan instead of just the South, which at the time of the Dutch was protected by a palisade, a wall. Wall Street is a trace of that wall that once was. So New York was now expanding, and its location made it a base for merchants and also for privateers, which is to say, official pirates, basically. Privateers were captains which privately owned ships that a government authorized to attack and capture enemy vessels. England or France or the Dutch Republic employed many of them in the 16th and 17th centuries, when Spain dominated in America and they were at war with Spain. It was a way of attacking other countries' fleets and disturbing their trade without engaging one's navy, and for free. The privateers were businessmen too. They could keep the profits from their loots, or at least part of it. It was dangerous business, obviously, but very lucrative potentially. So privateers would get access to the ports of the kingdom they worked for. and English privateers that were encouraged to attack Spanish ships and Spanish colonies, especially in the Caribbean or in the Atlantic, could anchor in Jamestown or New York. Now, in colonial parts that were far from their country of belonging, where law enforcement was sometimes non existent, there was a large gray area around trade, privateering, and piracy. And that was very much the case of New York. Merchants would trade with pirates and smuggle goods. Privateers were often the kind of people who could turn to piracy if they thought their interests would be better served this way. And even the authorities could be complicit in this. A governor called Benjamin Fletcher in the 1690s was accused of complicity with pirates. And it is only in the following century, the 18th century, that the rule of law began to be better enforced in and around the port of New York. Which brings us back to William Kidd, Captain Kidd and his alleged treasure. Kidd is a good example of merchant turned privateer turned pirate. He was born in 1645 in Scotland and became relatively affluent by trading in the Atlantic and marrying a rich widow from New York, a widow of Dutch and English descent, which represented well the very small high society of New York by the late 17th century. Remember, there were barely 5,000 residents at the time. It was still rather small, and the time of mansions and big fortunes had not started yet. But she was as wealthy as one could be in New York at the time. And William Kidd had become a respected member of the merchant community of New York. He owned property in Lower Manhattan, so he was well established. But apparently he wanted more. Or he needed more. Maybe to sustain his comfortable life or repay debts. Because in 1695 he became a privateer based in New York with a privateering commission from King William III of England. At the time, in 1695, the 9 Years' War was raging in Europe, a war between France and King Louis IV, the Sun King, and an alliance of England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain. This alliance had been built to counter the expansionist policies of Louis XIV, and the 9 Years' War was fought primarily in Europe. But it also had repercussions in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans too, where France, Spain, and England were competing. So Kidd was tasked with capturing French vessels and suppressing piracy in the Indian Ocean, quite far from New York. But by the late 17th century, the Indian Ocean was disputed, and both sides commissioned privateers to harass their enemies' ships. So Kidd sailed to the Indian Ocean. But there, things didn't turn out as expected. His ship, the Adventure Galley, failed to spot French targets to attack. And on top of that, the expedition faced logistical issues. They had a hard time finding ports to refit the ship and rest a little in the Indian Ocean. The crew was very unhappy. So, from privateer, Kidd descended into piracy and started to attack neutral or Allied ships, anything he could find. He captured a vessel off the coast of India, the Kedag Merchant, which carried valuable cargo, silk, spices, and gold. But faced with a lack of supplies and a risk of mutiny, he abandoned his ship, the Adventure Galley, and returned to New York with the one he had captured and supposedly its precious cargo on board. By 1699, he was back in New York, where he sold the captured ship, the Kedak Merchant, for an estimated £70,000, a fortune at the time equivalent to millions today. He distributed some of it to the remaining crew and maybe to his business partners who had funded the expedition. We don't know the details, and reportedly he buried the rest, his share, the lion's share of the spoils, which would have to be hidden somewhere along the coast, possibly on Long Island or Gardiner's Island, which is a small island near Long Island, or maybe even somewhere in Manhattan, near his home. Why bury this treasure after his return to New York? Because piracy charges were coming at him. Word of his actions in the Indian Ocean had spread to New York, and it was probably safer for him to hide his fortune somewhere and retrieve it later, when he would have cleared his name somehow. But he could never do so. He had hoped, apparently, that the governor of New York would protect him, because the governor was one of the backers of his privateering expedition. But instead, pressured to act against piracy, the governor turned against him and arrested him. Kidd was sent to London to be tried for piracy. He was found guilty in a trial that seems to have been biased against him, but still, it is true that he committed acts of piracy, and in 1701 he was hanged. The legend of his buried treasures was ready to spread because he took the secrets of what had happened to his fortune to his grave. Only a fraction of the Quebec merchant's ship cargo, the ship that he captured, was ever accounted for. Before his trial, while still in New York, he had also told the governor and other people about the treasure he had hidden, probably hoping to leverage this to gain protection. It didn't work, but obviously if it was true, and there was really a hidden treasure, he never revealed its location because he would have immediately lost all leverage and sentenced himself to death. The places where he was rumored to have hidden the treasure, Long Island, Gardiner's Island, or Manhattan, are the ones where he reportedly went after his return to New York. So these are the locations where he would have been able to hide something. But despite centuries of rumors and searches, nothing was ever found, or at least revealed. But it is still possible that a member of his crew, or a lucky treasure hunter, found the jackpot and just got away with it, never revealing where their new fortune came from. It is hard to imagine that the treasure could still be buried untouched on Manhattan or Queens or Brooklyn in the western part of Long Island, because these areas have been urbanized for a long time now. Their soil dug and disturbed repeatedly. So if the treasure existed and was there once, it should have been found. But the rest of Long Island that is less dense, or possibly other locations along the Atlantic coast, could possibly be locations for the treasure, if it ever existed. And this is why, somewhere in New York City, or close, there could still be a pirate treasure from the 17th century waiting to be discovered. And that may not be the only treasure. We are now going to fast forward in time by almost a century and talk of another treasure that disappeared in the East River between Manhattan, Queens, and the Bronx during the American Revolution. The treasure of the HMS Hussar, a British frigate. So, we are back in New York, but in the 1780s and along the 18th century, New York experienced a remarkable development. You remember it had around 4,000 to 5,000 souls by the 1690s. 90 years later, it now had over 25,000, an expansion that was not linear nor peaceful. New York had turned into a major colonial trade hub at this point. It was the second largest city of the 13 colonies, behind Philadelphia, which had 40,000, but ahead of Boston, with around 16,000, and Charleston, with 14,000. New York was a bit more chaotic than other colonial cities because of its particular mix of nationalities that could lead to conflicts. The class divide was more pronounced there than in other places, with huge fortunes living near horrible poverty, and there were racial tensions too. Enslaved Africans accounted for 15 to 20% of the population, and the fear of a revolt was permanent. Another fear was the danger of attacks by Native Americans at the start of the 18th century in particular. So there was prosperity, yes, and Manhattan had been partly urbanized, expanding from its historical center to the south. But New York was prone to revolts and a degree of social violence. In the 1770s, unrest against British rule was on the rise, and it culminated with the Revolution, the War of Independence, starting in 1775. Now, New York was not one of the centers of the rebellion. Quite the opposite. It was a loyalist stronghold during the war, remaining loyal to the UK. Why? Because due to its strategic importance, it was quickly seized by British troops in 1776 and heavily occupied from 1776 to the end in 1783. The occupation suppressed revolts against the British and made New York a kind of safe haven for loyalists. So this is where they went, where they concentrated when they had to flee other cities. A second reason that made New York a loyalist city was that its economy was very tied to colonial trade, and it had prospered as a port, exporting timber, fur, agricultural goods to other colonies and Great Britain. So the elite of the city was afraid that independence would disrupt that trade. They just didn't want things to change. And finally, the third reason is the population of New York included large groups inclined towards loyalism. There were many Anglicans tied to the Church of England, the descendants of the Dutch that were often wealthy landowners and not inclined at all to change a situation that favored them so much. The slaves, too, who were offered freedom by the British if they joined the Loyalist cause, and also many recent English and Scottish migrants that remained naturally loyal to their country of origin. So, in short, New York was the most important Loyalist base during the American Revolution, and a lot of British troops were stationed there. These troops had to be supplied and paid, and that's what the frigate Hussar, the 28-gun ship, was there to do. She was sent with months of salaries for thousands of troops, and of course, you see what is coming. She sank. She sank in the East River's Hell Gate Passage, a waterway named like this because it was notoriously dangerous, treacherous. Hell Gate is what is called a tidal strait, and it was dangerous to navigate because it was the place where various currents were driven by tides, so changing along the day meant creating constant disturbances. There were also rocks. It was narrow, not a big deal for small or modern ships, and nowadays a bridge, the Hell Gate Bridge, crosses it. But at the time for slow and big sailing ships, it was a risky move to sail through Hell Gate. Still, that's what the HMS Hussar did, and it led to disaster. She touched rocks and sank rapidly, and she sank with a lot of gold and silver on board. How much exactly? This is uncertain, but it has been valued at up to £4 million. £4 million of 1776 are equivalent to hundreds of millions today. It was a real fortune. Most of the crew made it to land and survived the wreck, but all of the gold and silver had sunk with the ship and turned out to be very hard to retrieve. Of course, divers were sent immediately to look for the treasure, but with the strong currents and the shifting riverbed that at the time had not been tamed, it turned out to be impossible to recover anything. And years later, when other attempts were made, they were not more successful. The treasure seemed to have vanished. Today, the trace of where the wreck exactly was has been lost between urban developments and changes in topography of the East River. The location of the wreck is unknown. Maybe some of the gold was retrieved before the wreck finished sinking. Maybe some of it was found and kept later by opportunists who dived on the site. Or more possibly, some of it was carried away by the current and dispersed across the East River. We don't know, but it's all well possible, likely even, that some of the gold of the Hussar still waits to be recovered somewhere underwater, mired in the East River. Let's return to our time machine and move forward again by a few decades, which takes us to the second half of the 19th century. New York had always been transforming, since its foundation as New Amsterdam. But in the 19th century, it went through a complete metamorphosis. From what was still a modest port compared with European and Asian ports to a global metropolis, a unique city, one of the major cities of the world. By 1800, so still in the early years of the independent United States, the population had begun to surge, and it reached 60,000. You remember it was around 25,000 during the American Revolution. In the 1900s, New York City was something else entirely. 3.4 million people, high buildings, and an industrial, commercial, and financial hub with countless factory chimneys, giant warehouses, and harbor equipment, a thriving stock market, universities and libraries, mansions, parks, and still the coexistence of extreme wealth and extreme poverty. Of success stories with the happy few making a fortune out of nothing, and many living a life of hard work that was barely sufficient to survive. In other words, an industrial metropolis at the forefront of modernity, with its promises, its hopes, its treasons, and its conflicts. In 1800, New York City had begun to take the lead among American cities to become the economic engine of America. Before, it seemed other cities could have competed with New York, Philadelphia, Boston, maybe Baltimore or New Orleans. But by 1820, they were all left behind already, and New York City was now the main gateway to America for people, ideas, culture, knowledge, capital, and innovations. It was inescapable. After the American Civil War, its growth only accelerated. The period between 1870 and 1900 is often called the Gilded Age for the U.S., a time of quick economic growth, industrialization, fortunes on a level that the U.S. had never seen before. During that period appeared the Goulds, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies. Fortunes sometimes built very quickly and on practices that were barely legal. On the stock market, in real estate, or in industries such as oil, steel, or railroads. The economy was mostly unregulated at the time, and for the adventurers and the unscrupulous risk takers, there were plenty of opportunities. That was a period during which New Yorkers were born and died in a completely different city, and its size and appearance were changing very fast, faster than today. Even though New York City never stopped changing, it is one of its defining features. Among the millions of destinies that cross paths in this period, in and around New York City, one stands out as particularly odd, intriguing. The life of the Leatherman, a vagrant, a vagabond, who was constantly on the move in the northeastern United States and came back to the same towns every 34 or 35 days for more than 30 years. He didn't exactly visit New York City every 34 days, but passed through the city's outskirts. Now, vagrants were quite common in the 19th century, and they were often seen in towns and villages across industrial nations as a plague. There were often very strict laws against them. They could be locked up for just not having a home, on the grounds that they were a threat to others, that they could steal, kill, transmit diseases. So they were dehumanized quite harshly. But the Leatherman was different. He was rather well accepted where he went, probably because he was not seen as a threat, and because people got to know him on his never-ending loop. He was nicknamed Leatherman because he always wore a very peculiar suit, handmade with patches of leather. A picture from 1885, 4 years before his death, shows what looks a bit like the skin suits worn by native people living near the Arctic Circle in the north of Canada or Siberia. Something that in any case looked completely out of place in 19th century New England. People did not know his name and only knew him as the Leatherman. He lived in different rock shelters and small caves and completed his loop, a 365-mile-long journey, every 5 weeks. That's almost 600 kilometers. On foot, obviously, which implies that he walked several hours per day on average. Along the way, he stopped in towns, always the same towns where he was known, and offered food, occasionally money. An old store kept a record of an order he left for bread, crackers, coffee, brandy, and beer, and he paid for that. There doesn't seem to be any known occurrence of the Leatherman stealing something, as he was reliable on his timing on the loop. People would have food ready for him, and because he was known, the local authorities will let him live his life unbothered, or even pass ordinances to exempt him from the local regulation against wanderers. In Connecticut, there was a tramp law, a law against vagrancy, passed in 1879. One of these laws against vagrancy I mentioned earlier. The first records of the Leatherman doing his loop are from around 1857, and he was found dead in 1889 in one of his usual caves in the town of Mount Pleasant, New York. What makes this person mysterious is a combination of this very strange behavior. On top of following his loop, he almost never talked. He was apparently fluent in French and didn't speak much English, but even in French, he would not speak much. There was also his appearance, with a leather suit, scarf, and hat, and his identity, which remains uncertain. All of this contributes to making his story bizarre. We don't know anything about his motivations. It would be tempting to believe he had a mental illness or any kind of psychological disposition that made him stay at the margin of society and obsessively repeating the same loop. That's possible. But in 1888, 1 year before his death, he was arrested and hospitalized. He was given a diagnosis of sane, except for an emotional affliction. He was basically found to have been sad, but otherwise perfectly normal psychologically. And as he had money and asked to be released, they let him go. It is possible some people gave him money, but this is another mystery about him. He didn't spend much, but he seemed to never go short on money, despite not working nor being seen stealing anything. His identity remains unknown. It is considered likely that he was from France or maybe French Canada. First, because he spoke French, and rumors at the time said he was from Picardy in the north of France. A French prayer book was also found among his possessions after his death, and it was observed that he always declined meat on Fridays, a typical Roman Catholic tradition. He was given a tomb and a tombstone. Said he was called Jules Bouclet and came from Lyon, France. But this name had appeared out of nowhere in a local newspaper and was retracted later. As of today, his true identity remains unknown, and he was given a new grave with a plaque that just reads the Leatherman. Was he an immigrant who did not integrate, or maybe could never adapt to the shock of arriving on a new continent? And so he began a life of wandering that became oddly comforting by repeating the same loop over and over. Or was he punishing himself for something? Or did he have a condition that made him lose track of time and everything else, and only focus on repeating the same journey until his death? We can only speculate. And more than 130 years after his death, the Leatherman remains a question mark. Some of the most iconic sights of New York City are from the Gilded Age, including the Brooklyn Bridge and, of course, the Statue of Liberty, which was inaugurated in its current site on Liberty Island in 1886. As you probably know, the statue was intended to be a gift to the United States by the people of France. The statue was designed and built in France and prepared to be shipped in pieces to be reassembled. But there were delays due to the Franco-Prussian War and funding problems. So in the end, its installation was made possible by a call for donations organized by publisher Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World, a newspaper that disappeared in the Great Depression. The same Pulitzer who gave his name to the Pulitzer Prizes. He attracted more than 100,000 American contributors. Most of them gave only $1 or less. But that was still money. $1 of 1885 was equivalent in purchasing power to $35 of today. And this completed the funding for the pedestal and the construction in New York City. So the Americans still paid for a part of their gift. But that was probably a good investment, because the Statue of Liberty would become a global icon of the 20th century, which was now nearing. And again, New York City continued its rise and surpassed London as the global city of the 20th century. Bigger, richer, concentrating economic, cultural, and political power with its international institutions. And this transition, as Europe was losing its world dominance and America was on the rise, can probably be dated to the 1910s and 1920s, as Europe was ravaged by the First World War, while the American economy was booming. You remember New York City had 3.4 million inhabitants in 1900. By 1950, it was 7.4 million, fueled by waves of immigrants now coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as more African Americans from the Southern states looking for factory and service jobs, and also a more accepting atmosphere in large black neighborhoods. The interwar period, the 20s and 30s, were the time when iconic skyscrapers were built, like the Empire State Building in 1931, the time of the Roaring Twenties, of Prohibition, too, from 1920 to 1933, with its consequences on underground life and crime, the time of the Harlem Renaissance, with its flourishing of African American art, literature, music, and also the background of our next mystery, the disappearance of Judge Joseph Force Crater in 1930. In New York City, more than in any other American cities, there was a before and after October 1929. The city was the epicenter of American finance, and the cascade of bank failures and bankruptcies of other businesses that followed the 1929 crash hit hard. The 1920s and 30s were also times of intense corruption, of ties between politicians, judges, and organized crime. It is common to hear about corruption in modern politics, and that's a legitimate concern. I'm not saying that it is acceptable, but looking at the pre-World War II situation really puts things into perspective. The 20s and 30s were a time when transparency was minimal, and at every level of civic life, shady things took place. Even though the disappearance of Joseph Crater is mysterious, it clearly looks tied to this background of corruption. Here are the facts. On August 6, 1930, a relatively young and recent judge on the New York Supreme Court vanished. He occupied, obviously, the most prestigious possible position for a judge at the state level, and he had been appointed there by the then governor of New York, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the future president. Crater was 41 and was last seen leaving a restaurant where he had been dining with his mistress, a showgirl. That sounds very cliche, but that's true. The investigators realized later that earlier that day he had engaged in unusual behavior. He had withdrawn more than $5,000 from two bank accounts, which is a hefty sum to be carried in cash, about $90,000 of today. He had also sold some investments and been removing files from his office, reportedly destroying some documents. Outside the restaurant, He told his companions he was heading to a Broadway show. He hailed a taxi and was never seen again. Crater was born in 1889 in Pennsylvania and had risen quickly through New York's legal and political ranks, being an ambitious lawyer with a successful practice he had created. He got married in 1917, aged 28, but he was also known to be a womanizer, with various affairs with showgirls and political connections to a political organization called Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall, officially the Society of Tammany, was a local organization of the Democratic Party in New York City. It dominated local politics and was known to be able to influence judicial appointments and decisions. It is most probably to these connections that he owed his appointment as a state supreme judge. His disappearance was reported, but nearly 3 weeks later. It had been noticed, obviously, the week after, when he failed to appear in court, but possibly to avoid a scandal. His wife and his politician friends delayed reporting. Of course, his activity with the withdrawal of money, the sale of investments, and the destruction of files immediately raised suspicions. This suggests that he was either preparing to flee or had sensitive materials to handle, such as blackmail or payment of a bribe. Still, judges on the Supreme Court are not supposed to go missing without an explanation, and the New York Police Department launched a massive search, interviewing hundreds and following leads across the U.S. and even abroad. As soon as the story broke, a media frenzy began, because it was juicy, of course. A judge, a mistress, serious suspicions of corruption. That was fascinating and seemed to validate everything everyone suspected. Yet, despite all the media interest and these efforts of the police, who may be an illusion of efforts because perhaps powerful people in New York were happy with the investigation going nowhere, nothing significant was found. No murder weapon, no body, no trace of the taxi, no evidence whatsoever. The following year, Crater was declared dead so his wife could access his estate. The case remained open, though, but nothing substantial ever surfaced, despite occasional new leads throughout the 1930s. He was allegedly sighted in various places: Virginia, California, Canada, or even in Europe. All of these sightings remained unverified, and that's what makes this disappearance mysterious. The shadiness of the story is obvious given his connections and behavior, but it's all blurry and non-conclusive. Open questions include he fled or was killed, the withdrawal of funds and document destruction suggest he may have planned to escape, possibly from personal troubles or a political or judiciary scandal having to do with Tammany Hall. But his knowledge and position could also have made him a target for assassination by mobsters or political operatives. Where did he go after the taxi? He was not found by the investigation having boarded a train or ship, even though he could have done it under another name? And also, why did the investigation turn out to be so ineffective? It is rare to pour that much work and come up with nothing, which always raised suspicion that the investigation was undermined by politicians or the judiciary or both. And this mystery persists today. It seems that if Crater was killed, his murderers got away with it, or if he fled, he did it successfully and went on to live somewhere else anonymously. In any case, his disappearance captivated New Yorkers at the time and became a symbol of the city's corruption and intrigue. For some time, pulling a crater became slang for vanishing suddenly. But the case also probably helped reduce corruption and shady ties between politics, judiciary, and law enforcement authorities. A commission in the 1930s exposed vulnerabilities in the judicial system and the illegitimate grip of Tammany Hall on it, which weakened this political machine and ultimately led to its demise in the 1930s and 40s. After more than 300 years of urbanization, New York City has seen dramatic changes at the surface. But like other large cities, there is a lot more there than what meets the eye. A lot more underground. In particular, sewers, tunnels for trains, subways, cars, even rumored tunnels for cattle. The cow tunnels that are not clearly identified but are rumored to have served in the 19th and 20th centuries to transport cows to the meat-packing district where slaughterhouses and meat processing facilities were located. And there are more underground networks, water pipes, electricity, and even an old and somewhat forgotten pneumatic tube mail system. What was that? In the 19th century, and even more in the 20th century, the Postal Service was critical to New York's commercial dominance. Millions of letters and packages had to be handled every day for residents, of course, but also businesses. Wall Street financial institutions, publishers in Midtown, everywhere. So all these packages and mail had to be moved around quickly and efficiently. And the technological answer to this was a pneumatic tube mail system, a kind of system that has become obsolete nowadays. But you may remember in the 1980s or 1990s, there were still businesses or administrations that used that kind of system for their internal mail. New York City had a large tube mail system of that kind. It transported mail at speeds up to 35 miles per hour between post offices in Manhattan and Brooklyn. Mail and parcels were put inside canisters, cylindrical canisters, that traveled through steel tubes propelled by air compression. Even emergency supplies could be sent that way, which was very convenient when surface traffic would have made it much slower. When in use, this mail system spanned 27 miles and connected 23 stations. 27 miles was obviously not enough to cover all of the boroughs of New York City. just the densest parts, and it handled a third of the city's mail, almost 100,000 letters per day at its peak. In 1953, the system had become obsolete and was decommissioned. Its maintenance was difficult and increasingly expensive after more than 50 years of intense service. As more and more trucks hit the roads, this old transportation system just couldn't keep up and started losing its importance compared to when it first started. So the tubes, the tunnels, were sealed and sometimes repurposed, but the majority remained abandoned. And that's a characteristic of urbanization we rarely think about. When systems become obsolete, they are generally not entirely repurposed or destroyed. They are abandoned and forgotten, which leaves layers upon layers of remains, from antique sewers to catacombs in Roman cities, to abandoned tunnels or crypts in medieval cities, or gas, electricity, train galleries in modern cities. Urban areas produce layer upon layer of forgotten underground networks. But even though they are no longer in use, they keep existing. Hundreds of thousands of people every day walk in Manhattan above these old and now useless steel tubes that only 120 years ago were constantly crossed by canisters traveling faster than cars, thanks to elaborate steam-powered compressors. Urban legends of the time suggest the tubes were used for other things too, such as safely moving around alcohol during Prohibition. This is unproven, but not impossible, because the system was designed to be hard to tamper with. The tubes are strong. Canisters could only be accessed in stations, so it would have been the perfect way to send a few bottles around Manhattan and Brooklyn. The old system is just one of many forgotten or decommissioned things under Manhattan. Another one, which is stunningly beautiful, is a decommissioned subway station, the City Hall subway station, located beneath City Hall Park. It was the inaugural station of New York's subway system. The concept of subways originated in the 19th century, and the first one ever inaugurated in 1863 was in London, the Tube. In 1900, Paris inaugurated its subway. In 1904, New York City. The City Hall station was intended as a spectacular showpiece. It was decorated in a Romanesque revival style, which is to say a kind of medieval architectural style, but not Gothic. Rather the style of the 11th century, and before that was closer to Roman architecture, but reinvented for the late 19th century with colorful tiles and brass chandeliers. And it was used for 40 years, until 1945, when it was closed to passengers because it could not be modernized. The station was too short and too curved to accommodate longer trains. And also, despite its visual appeal, it had low ridership, so it was not considered absolutely necessary. The station is no secret. It remains occasionally accessible through guided tours, but it hasn't served passengers since December 1945. Its entrances were covered, But contrary to other abandoned subway stations, because there are others, it was preserved for its aesthetic and historical significance. But there are many other underground buried structures, tunnels for trains, and subways that were completely forgotten just to be rediscovered decades later. Their abandonment and fall into oblivion, coming from the growth of New York City, its changes into urbanism plans, and sometimes a multiplicity of factors, private and public, that meant archives could be dispersed and lost. There were also financial difficulties at times, like in the 1970s. This is not an exhaustive list, but rediscovered structures include, for example, an abandoned railroad tunnel, the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel in Brooklyn. It was constructed in 1844. One of these railroads from the early boom of American railroads, and it served to connect downtown Brooklyn to main rail lines. The tunnel was sealed only 17 years later, in 1861, due to safety concerns, and it remained apparently forgotten for more than a century until it was rediscovered by an engineering student in 1980. Behind the sealed brick wall, he found a tunnel that maybe no one had entered for 120 years. Even though millions of people walked above it every year. None of this is proven, but again, legends and rumors quickly appeared stating that the tunnel was used during Prohibition to store alcohol and other gang-related stuff. Yet another example. You know Grand Central Terminal, a large train and subway commuter terminal that connects different subway lines and train lines. The station opened in 1913, and the building itself is big, but not as impressive as the vast underground network of tracks, platforms, and utility spaces under it. Most of the station is actually underground, and this part is so vast that in the 1990s, hidden chambers beneath the terminal were rediscovered. Some were sealed off areas that had apparently not been visited since the 1930s. Part of this underground facility, buried 10 stories underground, is named M42. It is said to have been used to house secret wartime equipment, maybe sometime between 1941 and 1945. During the Second World War, this area was allegedly a high security site, with rumors that a secret presidential rail car was kept here for President Roosevelt. As of today, this is off limits to the public. Yet another example of these forgotten subterranean structures is Water Tunnel Number 1, an aqueduct 18 miles long, completed in 1917, that delivers water from the Catskills to Manhattan and Brooklyn. The Catskill Mountains are low mountains, a subrange of the Appalachian Mountains in the southeastern part of New York State. So this old aqueduct includes massive underground vaults and valve chambers under Manhattan, some as large as subway stations, designed to regulate water flow. The aqueduct in general was not forgotten, of course. It has been in use since its construction, But in the 1980s, workers rediscovered underground chambers near the Brooklyn Bridge and in Midtown that had apparently been closed and forgotten since the early years of work in the 1920s. They contained old tools of the early 20th century and original graffiti. No one had apparently set foot inside for more than 60 years. These chambers, too, are inaccessible to the public. There are various other examples of these forgotten and rediscovered structures found during maintenance, or when the foundation of towers are laid, or when old plans are found in forgotten archives, just to name a few. Subway tunnels from the 1970s for a Second Avenue subway that had been dug but never exploited due to a big financial crisis in 1975. They were sealed and rediscovered when the project was revived in 2007. Another example is a tunnel belonging to an older aqueduct. The old Croton Aqueduct, completed in 1842 but decommissioned in 1955. In the 1990s, urban explorers and historians rediscovered segments of it under the Upper West Side and Harlem. In fact, visitors and even inhabitants of the different boroughs of New York City have their eyes set on the surface with all its activity. Buildings, offices, restaurants, stores, parks, whatever. But they tend to forget that another hidden, mysterious city sits under their feet, made of many different networks, some still in activity and vital to the city, and others much older and sometimes completely forgotten. This is also what makes the soul of a city. Of course, there would be much more to tell about New York City, but we have reached the end of our story for tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep, or if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.